We are live.
Good morning, everyone. Back again to continue our discussions from segment 2 of this morning's presentations. Back to you, Jen.
Great. I have a suggested place to begin with your agreement. So Senator Bray and Representative Sheldon, let me know if this makes sense to you. So this is a time for open discussion among the working group members, and you have the benefit of having your morning presenters here to still answer clarifying questions and to pull up slides as needed. So TJ Poor, Director of Regulated Utility Planning, Vermont Department of Public Service is here. And then also Dean Murphy, the principal, and Wanjung Chang, the senior associate and economist, both from the Brattle Group, are also still here with slides available as needed. My thinking, there's 2 questions that are in the queue already. They include, Senator Bray, a question you just raised before the break around understanding a little bit more the margin of error or uncertainty in these estimates from a practical standpoint, as I understood it. And there's a second batch of questions from earlier around, came from Senator Watson's comment, but I think many of you had similar questions around the assumptions regarding the cost of solar and how that might skew the effect on the GDP for Vermont. So that was a request to understand the rationale potentially behind those assumptions and maybe how to mitigate the skewed effects. So we'll start with those 2 areas, but before we go there, I'm wondering how many of you are sitting on different questions other than those 2 that you would like to raise. And if you can raise your hand and your virtual hand and leave them raised, that'll be helpful for me in managing some time. And again, these are going to be questions that are separate from the ones that are already in the queue. I'm going to hold tight for just a minute while you have a minute to think about that and raise your hands again. Please leave them raised. So I have Chase, Christopher, Peter, and Brian. Are there others? All right, you can put your hands down. So here is and Representative Sibilia, I've got yours too, and also Mia. Okay, great. Here's why that is helpful, because as you unfold with these different topics, my guess is that it will emerge, other questions will emerge for you. So you'll want to raise your hand with a comment, and to the extent that we can batch some of those content similar pieces, then let's do that. I'm going to use this list that I just came up with the queue to come back to when we finish off a topic. And my goal will be try to get through all of them. We'll see how far we get. So first question up to Senator Bray's question, the margins of error. Senator Bray, if I didn't characterize that question well, you can restate it.
No, that's fine. I'm not, it's a model. We know there's some potential for inaccuracies. And I was just noticing that we were talking about very subtle differences in terms of like a decreased rate of growth, stuff like that. And sometimes we're into, 0.00 and a number. So I just want to understand how those numbers fall within, how they look at something that's that fine-grained, and how we should read them in terms of confidence that we know this kind of thing will happen.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. Wanjun, perhaps you can put up slide number, I think, 16, which is the first one showing on the GDP growth. And just as a reference while we're talking. You're absolutely right. This is a model. The model comes up with a very precise estimate, and yet there's quite a bit of uncertainty in the real world. And I don't want to suggest that we can project GDP in the business as usual or any of these scenarios with the kind of precision that the results appear to show. If you look at the GDP projected growth in the top left of this slide, it shows GDP growing from Vermont's GDP growing from a little under 35 billion in 2023 to it's about 41 billion, I believe, in 2035. if we come back in 2035 and pull up this chart and plot on top of it the actual GDP year by year that Vermont records over the next 12 years, it won't lie on top of this line. I don't know which direction it will be off. It will probably be off in both directions at different points in time when you look at it historically. So I think it is important to recognize that, especially the size of the effects that we are looking at here, are quite small relative to the statewide economy. Which is not to say that these effects are unimportant. If Vermont is going to do something that will increase, potentially or likely cause an increase in customer rates, even if that increase is relatively small, it is something worth considering and deliberating about. But in terms of what it's going to do to state GDP, I'd have to acknowledge that in hindsight, you will not be able to see it for the noise that will occur. I mean, if a recession occurs, it's a drop in GDP, and we're not projecting a drop in GDP, but those do happen, and then a recovery can cause a rapid increase in GDP. There is a lot of noise relative to the precision that is apparent in a model like this.
Right. Well, thanks very much. It's helpful to put it in context. You know, of course, we end up drilling in. We have a fiduciary responsibility, so we drill in. We're trying to get the details, make the smartest possible investments. But I'm also feeling like, given that there's such a strong shared sentiment in Vermont about being responsive to climate change, that when one line lays over the other so closely that we can't distinguish them, I wouldn't want people to hear a decrease and have that word decrease or negative ring so loudly that it obscures the overall growth pattern, which is so close no matter which scenario we choose. So thanks so much for that.
Exactly right. And it's also worth remembering that this analysis does not capture the largest pieces of benefits, which are the greenhouse gas reductions. Many of those benefits fall outside Vermont, of course, but they're real nonetheless.
Yeah, thank you.
Comments or questions related to that? Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure that anyone can precisely answer my question, but on one of your slides from the Brattle slides, there was an indication that these investments in Vermont sort of have a social benefit beyond Vermont. So we're sort of asked to pay a little more than our share, and that's, you know, to Senator Bray's point, I think that sort of stood out to me as we're trying to uncover what Montpelier should do. But historically, going back 3-4 years, as the legislature passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, a data point that stood out to me was our very clear lagging relative to New England in terms of emissions reduction. And so I guess I'm curious if anyone could comment. It seems to me now this proposed investment is making up for that. And so on balance, we probably come in about even, and one might say where we ought to be given our participation in the region as members of society. But anyway, I'm wondering if that seems realistic, that this is kind of a reflection of our slacking, and now we're potentially looking at making up for that.
Obviously outside the scope of the analysis that we've been asked to present here today. But I think it's a fair observation whether Vermont is slacking depends a lot on which comparison group you choose. If you choose New England states, you'll get a different answer than if you choose a different group of states in the US or a different country, depending on who you choose. And so there is something to be said for, as you observed and correctly, Vermont is being asked to pay for things that will benefit the globe as a whole. Everyone else is being asked to do the same thing. That Massachusetts is being asked to do things that will benefit Vermont also, as well as Brazil and Europe. Everyone, because greenhouse gases are a global pollution, their effects don't fall locally. Everyone is being asked to do things whose direct benefits fall mostly on others. And that's just the nature of a public good, or a tragedy of the commons, as we discussed earlier.
Okay, thank you.
And is this specific to sort of the margins of error and uncertainty? Otherwise, I'm preparing to move on to the next question.
It was kind of a reaction to what Chris just said. Wanted to ask TJ if he has. I hear two different things, right? I keep hearing that Vermont's a laggard, but then I hear on our power supply in particular, which is tier 1 and tier 2, what we're talking about, that Vermont emissions are actually very low. So when I hear laggard, I tend to think heating and transportation. And I'm curious if the DPS has a reaction to kind of the two different perspectives there.
Yeah, as we track our emissions based on the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory, which is how the Global Warming Solutions Act targets were set, the electricity portfolio is really quote unquote clean, right? Or low emitting, and most of our emissions are coming from the transportation and thermal sectors. So, where the savings, I talked about this last time, I think, the kind of the difference on how we account and track under the GWSA, which are our legally required goals, and how, what the impact new projects have on the physical emissions that happen in New England, in that they reduce what's on the margin. But in terms, of the GWSA, there's like an empirical, that creates a little bit of an empirical data problem. Like, we always talk about these two different things and blend them. We also, when we think about our electric sector, we set these on targets from like 1990, when Vermont was relatively clean, and Massachusetts, in terms of its portfolio, even then, and Massachusetts, the rest of New England, had a lot of coal-fired power plants, et cetera. So we're able to make gains in different ways than Vermont was able to make gains on. And so there's a lot of context that goes into that, and I think there's a lot of different perspectives you could take as to whether, we're a laggard or we've been so far ahead of the game on the electric sector. And so I'll stop there, because I could kind of wax poetic about that for a while, but.
There was quite a few comments, and I know there will be some discussion around this, so I'll try my best to put some words to it, and then if others of you can add your dimensions, you're welcome to by raising your hand. Just let us know. So again, I'm going back to Senator Watson's comment. She's not on the call now, but because she has another commitment right now, but she will be watching the discussion, and those of you who'd like to chime in can add to it. She asked about the assumptions regarding the cost of solar and how that skews the effect on GDP in Vermont per the modeling. Both the rationale for why those assumptions might have been used, and maybe there's a question in there about how to mitigate the skewed effects. So I'll turn this first to the presenters, but then others of you may have comments. TJ, I think it goes to you first from the CEA analysis.
On the cost of solar, we've tried to have this model be kind of an open book, so we're happy to actually look at what the impact of a different cost of solar is, and circle back on that, and then how it impact, like what the impact is, and recall there's another big cost that isn't included in here. So there's potential competing impacts, and I don't want to I don't want to lose that and have people at the end of the day say, "Oh, the department like just added this other cost to offset what might be a reduction in cost." I, you know, the model we're open to kind of this kind of feedback. This is why we've made this model open book, and we've had stakeholder advisory group discussions, and we want to actually get the quote unquote right, or like a reasonable number into the model, so that we can not talk about the numbers so much, and more talk about where to place emphasis. So I don't know the magnitude off the top of my head of what would happen if we put 12 cents in instead of 14 cents, what is in there. But we can try and look at that. It would have less rate impact, I can tell you that, but I don't know how big, if it's going to make it look, if it's going to be noticeable or not. I don't know.
Dean, you were nodding. Did you have anything to add to that?
Just agreement with TJ that if the costs are lower, the rate impact will be smaller.
Mm-hmm. Comments on this question? You can raise your hand. I'm going to defer to folks who haven't spoken yet, and then come back around to those who have. Ben, go ahead, and then we'll go with Ken and Representative Sibilio.
Thanks. TJ mentioned, or Peter had raised earlier, the standard offer as a sort of counterpoint. TJ used the word anecdotal there, so I went on one of the breaks and looked at all the standard offer contracts from, well, not the actual contracts, but the reported prices for the power from those contracts since, sort of standard offer 2.0 for folks, not like the early 50 megawatt stuff. That's, old news and still in the mix, but not something that is being built today, obviously. The last time we had a contract in the standard offer for anything in the sort of 2 megawatt plus size range that TJ referenced, those C numbers being based on, or C numbers being based on, was the 2013 tranche of contracts, so a decade ago. And if you look at 2015 to the present only for contracts that have actually resulted in built projects, it's a range per kilowatt hour of 8.9 to 12.4 cents. And the 5 most expensive of those were built by utilities. If you look at just the privately developed ones, the range is 8.9 to 11.1 cents, and the average is 10.2 to 10.6 cents per kilowatt hour. So, we're talking, looking at like a 40 to 50% higher than, actually built cost in the SEA model. I would love to see a model run that actually uses, the real prices from standard offer contracts over the last several years. That feels like the most reasonable, accurate starting point for this kind of analysis. I appreciate the transparency, TJ, and that it, is something that that could be modeled. I'm disappointed that we weren't using Vermont data to begin with, when that's a state program and the data is readily available. It took me all of 10 minutes to crunch those numbers.
So I just, like I said, I don't know if this call, well, first, I don't know if this call is the right time to hash out what the right value to rerun is. I think there was what we've been told in the past by Renewable Energy Vermont as well, is that those standard offer projects are not like the norm and not going to continue at like the 8.5 cents, 9 cents that so for your, which is part of the average. A lot of those were financed and developed like a couple of years ago and just kind of coming online now. So I think there's some there's some value, and like I said, I'm happy to. We've tried to be as open book as possible, and really, I don't know if we were talking past each other or we didn't hear this comment earlier in the process, but the first time really that this is, an actual number concern is coming up is this week, and we've said that the model is available for several weeks. So I'm really happy to try and see what the right number is. I want, my whole goal in this whole process was to try and not argue over somebody's putting the thumb on the scale on numbers. It's to find a common set of reasonable assumptions that we can look, and then we can argue where we need to over where to place emphasis. And if we do disagree on an input, it's a really clear and distinct input. And I'm worried that this process hasn't gone like we intended, like everybody intended, the stakeholder advisory group, the department, in that this is only coming up now. The methodology was described at the very beginning. And, I'll take some blame that maybe the department should have been more diligent of putting some Vermont layer on that number. But it wasn't, let's try and find a reasonable path forward.
Thanks, TJ. Yeah, I'm happy to take this offline.
So the question you put out there is, how do you get a Vermont layer or nuance on that number? Not something that's going to be resolved during this call, but an open question that there's some willingness to lean into. The comments I have in the queue, Ken, and then Representative Sibilia. I see, Louis, that you raised your hand as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll just say I prefer to see this done by utility. So not everybody's getting what they want in the analysis. I think the DPS is trying to do a good middle ground. As far as the solar in particular, just a couple of data points. I mean, I sit on the VEPI board, which is charged with managing standard offer. And we're seeing those projects that were bid low are being delayed. Anybody who's in EPUC I'm getting requests for extensions daily. So those prices and the bids were accepted before we saw the inflationary issues come up and before we ran into supply chain problems. So I wouldn't necessarily say standard offer is a good representation of what solar costs today. And just a couple of data points from my perspective, I'm negotiating 2 solar projects right now, one in Ludlow and one in Enosburg. And those prices on the low end are a little over 10 cents. And on the high end, they're about 12.5 cents. So they're lower than what was used in the study, but they're not the 8 to 10 that you're seeing in the standard offer pricing. And I'll just note to Ben, the 12.4 was actually a VEPSA project in standard offer that was developed by a private entity. And because of the way that's structured, it ended up being more expensive. But I think the price that we were bid was closer to what was quoted for the private entities there. So the market has moved. I'll stop there.
Representative Sibilia.
Happy to defer to Louis and then ask my question since I have spoken.
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to point out that if we're talking about Vermont numbers, we've got to include net metering costs in that mix. It's not just standard offer, and net metering comes in at 50% more than the numbers Ben was quoting, or possibly more. So I'm fine with using Vermont numbers if we've got it, but we got to have to use all the Vermont numbers in that case. Thanks.
Yeah, and just for clarity, Louis, we hadn't focused on it today, but the net metering, we're focused on kind of the larger size price, I think, is the discussion, but there's also a separate line item for net metering costs and a separate amount of net metering that's assumed in the model going forward that applies that different cost.
Yeah, I understood. I'm just saying solar in Vermont is not all of those handful of low cost solar projects that are proposed through standard offer right now. There's a lot of previous standard offer projects. There's a lot of net metering. There's a lot of other renewable projects that are contribute in the aggregate significantly to what we're talking about, and the price of those cannot be ignored. Thanks.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes, so appreciate the conversation. Really want to make sure that we have a number or a data point used in analysis, that there is shared agreement, not a dollar point, but like what is the factor that we should be looking at. I think it's important that we try and have some consensus around that. I appreciate TJ's willingness to kind of look at this. Perhaps the number's right. I'm open to perhaps the number's right. It did strike me as I wasn't expecting the analysis the way that it the number came in. My question, I guess, is more for you, Jen, and or our co-chairs, and I'd like to see us kind of nail down some agreement about how we're going to resolve this, because I see the calendar.
And when you talk about agreement to resolve this, you're talking about the cost assumptions going into solar for the modeling.
Yeah.
And it links a little bit to Senator Bray's question around how you end up using the modeling and to what extent you use it to be it's informing decisions and the nuances you can take from it, informing decisions versus defining and making decisions.
Yeah, well, I think that the rates, I think people will, whatever the projected rates are, even if they are projections, not locked in stone, they are going to be looked to and utilized as a rationale for doing or not doing, or so I do think it's if we have something, if it's a minimal scale difference, that's one thing, but
that's a question maybe to actually ask those of you who work with the data, and it might even be, I don't know if it's a macroeconomics or if it's going to go back to you, TJ. What is the weight of that difference? Is it a big difference? Is it a small difference if you include a different set of numbers? How does it actually change the scenario analysis?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I can't answer it fully. I can say that, half of the new solar in Vermont is assumed to be net metering for at least the near term, so that it doesn't affect that part. And then the new solar is, increments of 10-20% of load, right, as we change tier 2. And so that that's a percentage of the cost. A lot of costs come from the tier 1 going to 100%. So I just I don't have a good number, but those are a couple of the factors that are swirling in my head right now. I think getting to the order of magnitude of how a change impacts, I think, can help either refine our focus on this question that we really need to dig in, or we could say, oh, it doesn't make as big of a difference as we thought, and we could maybe be okay with a little more play there. Better word.
How does that get determined? That question go to you, TJ, or also to the co-chairs?
I think it's seeing to if our consultants will do another model run, or if we, as we get trained up on actually how to use the model over the next few weeks, that we do it ourselves.
Okay, and part of the reason that exercise might answer the question of how much of a weight or change does the change in those cost assumptions, how much does it affect the outcome?
Right, of the rate impact. I should, ask this question indeed, or June is, it seemed to me that the GDP impacts, the macroeconomic impacts were really small to start with and probably wouldn't change the analysis that much, but I don't know that.
I think that's a fair assessment. If we're seeing a small impact from the rate increase that we see now, so if we have an even smaller rate increase because solar is cheaper in Vermont than had been assumed, then the GDP impact shrinks further. Just directionally.
Right. So that speaks to, in my mind, I would say that that maybe the department should try and get an order of magnitude out to people, but it may not make sense for Brattle to rerun its model because unless the signs flip, then it might not be worth it. And by signs flip, meaning that solar is inexpensive enough that it actually has a rate benefit.
And if that were the case, it might not matter so much whether you increased your RES, it might penetrate anyway. It wouldn't be driven necessarily by the RES. If it was cheaper, people might do it regardless of RES.
Right. Good point.
Co-chairs, I'm looking for an indication of what you're thinking at this point.
I guess I'm hearing TJ offer to help us find out what the kind of impact this could have. Like if we change it by a few cents to make it maybe line up more with what we're hearing from many members of this group that the actual costs are. What would be the time frame for that, TJ?
I hopeful that it would be the week after Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving's next week. A lot of people are out. I will try to see what it can do as soon as possible, but I can't give a firm timeline here. You know, from SEA's perspective, I think that they just want the values to be that they put in their model to be substantiated, and so this maybe if I'm not going to force them to issue a final report that says something they don't believe, but it could be like a Vermont sensitivity or something. And I'm not saying that they won't. I have not had this conversation with them, so but I just want to throw that out there. And so
does it make sense to have a couple people from this group help you substantiate? I mean, I've heard maybe differing opinions from Lewis Porter and Ben Walsh. So I don't know how to get to a Vermont number is the first question, so that many of us, maybe most of us, could agree to it.
Happy to take any and all data. We do have the standard offer data, Ben. Thank you for pointing that out. And so you don't necessarily need to send that, but we can include that into consideration. And then other data outside of standard offer particularly for completed projects, and then change how the market has changed since those projects have been completed, and understanding those two things.
So are there folks in this room that can help with that and are willing to? Ben is Lewis, great. A question I have is you said, oh, well, half of the solar in there is net metered. And so the price for net metering, is that just standard, or are we, how's that number been derived?
No, because it depends entirely on what generation of net metering it was. And the expectation is based on based on the department's analysis, the expectation is that the price for net metering will continue to go down as the PUC reviews it. I don't want to put words in TJ's mouth here, but I think that's the department's assumption, is that the PUC will continue decreasing the price of net metering as solar becomes cheaper and whatever.
Can't tell if you're thinking, TJ, or if you're
trying to pull up my screen. Sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Can folks see my screen now?
Yes,
I can see it.
I'm just going to keep it in this mode if that's okay. And so this is the net metering price forecast, and it is kind of a little above 14 cents, and it's kind of a relatively flat line, increasing slightly. the embedded net metering is kind of already included in the business as usual, but this is for new net metering. And so net metering comes in at, a lot of it is at the retail, starts at the blended retail rate, and then with adjusters, and then there's other, and then it increases over time with rates. And so, and then there's a blend of, bigger projects and smaller projects in here. So, just I wanted to share this just to give people a sense of what the price was in here. I think it's coincidental that it's around 14 cents, similar.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think we have a path forward on the Vermont rate. Are we ready to move on, Jen, or is there more?
So DPS will look into doing another run. Whether it's presented as a final depends on how it's substantiated, and that's the SEA chimes in there, but the exercise may still be completed. The timeline is uncertain in terms of whether it's ready before your next meeting on the 29th. That's a very tight timeline, but you do have 2 folks from the working group willing to chime in and assist with some of that data. That's Ben and Lewis.
Well, and TJ, you may be doing this anyway, but it does strike me that SEA may be able to answer it. Like, well, plus or minus 2 cents isn't going to have, how big is that real change going to be?
Right. I will ask that. If there's a quick answer to that, I will provide that immediately.
Excellent.
Okay, great. So an update on that at least could be ready by November 29th, which is the next convening of this working group. There's other comments related to this question. We have a queue of other voices here and time is running short, but around the cost assumptions around solar.
Unfortunately, I think it's a complicating factor, but if we are talking to going to 100% renewable on the grid by 2030, then to me, it begs a question of what's the appropriate role of net metering post 2030. I don't know how that will affect modeling. But...
Is that a question for PJ?
Well, it's just, we're looking ahead and we're modeling and thinking about these things. And one of the concerns about local renewable generation is from what source and at what price. And to the degree that we just assume net metering continues on out through 2035, to me, it raises a question about might the RES speak to net metering as we look at how to most cost effectively and get there. So,
yeah, I can respond as it relates to our model is that, that assumption of kind of a business as usual net metering was included kind of on purpose because we didn't know exactly how to design a net metering changes to net metering because there's a million different ways you could do that. But one of the things that I liked about it is that it, sets this kind of baseline, and it seems to me that it's an opportunity for a lever to pull of saying, hey, as we're balancing trade-offs, maybe there's we can lower the rate impact by, changing how Vermonters access renewable energy to a more cost-effective way. I don't think there's any debate that net metering is the most expensive way we procure solar. It provides different values and benefits and access, but just on a cost per kWh basis, it is more expensive. And so if we can meet some of the objectives of net metering through different mechanisms at a lower cost, then that is a lever we can pull that, uses the foundation of this modeling to kind of come to a better solution going forward.
Thanks.
So I'm going to go back to my list. Dean,
if I could provide a bit of perspective on this based on work I've done in a number of other New England states as well as other regions, you're getting into a question that is far bigger than the scope of what either the PSD or Brattle has done. In the long run, if we are to decarbonize the grid, and I mean the New England grid, not Vermont's share of it, you'll run into lots of issues like timing. Solar is great. It displaces fossil, but after a while, when there's no fossil left to displace, you get a lot of energy in the daytime when the sun is shining and not much at night when the sun is not shining. Sometimes the wind blows, sometimes it doesn't. There are issues of system balancing that arise as New England as a whole approaches 100% renewable or 100% clean generation that are very important. Vermont at the moment can sort of lean on the rest of the New England system, which is far bigger than Vermont, to provide those balancing services. In the long run, if all of New England is clean, there becomes a real question about how you can make that system operate. I'm fully convinced that it can be done based on work that I've done, that other people have done, but it's not simply requiring RECs through an RPS won't work at a whole system level. The other thing to keep in mind
and
is
Dean,
that,
this will have to be a quick keep in mind because there are other topics waiting that we don't know yet. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. The other thing is that by the time you reach 100%, you're halfway roughly where you need to go. Because if we do electrify most of the rest of the economy, electric load will increase considerably from where it will be in 2030 or 2035 after that. And so considerably more clean generation will be needed even after you hit 100% of the 2030 or 2035 numbers.
Thank you.
I'll stop there. This is a much bigger question than what we're trying to address here.
Many big questions. So I may not have been clear at the front when I was asking for a queue of hands. I was looking for those of you who had had distinct topics other than the two we've been talking about, and we don't know what they are yet. I do want to know what's top of mind for you. So I'm assuming now that we're moving away from the cost assumptions to solar and moving on to a new topic. Chase, you're up.
Thanks, Jen. I wanted to go back to really sort of the beginning of today's meeting and talk a little bit about the estimated benefits of moving towards a 100% res, and specifically one that contemplates new renewables being built. So in those series of little bar graphs where there was the cost bar adjacent to the benefit bar, that's the slide that TJ was speaking about that I'm thinking of right now.
Would it be helpful to have it pulled up?
Could be, yeah, sure. Yeah, if you've got that handy, TJ, that'd be great.
And then I think what I'm looking for, Chase, is the high points, either the highlights that you'd like people to know or the question that you would have that you'd like to have answered.
Thanks, Jen. So we have been for the past few minutes talking about assumptions that went into the costs that you see represented here. And we've identified that when you actually look at Vermont numbers, rather than numbers from other states, likely the difference in costs here will be substantial, perhaps like 40-ish% lower. So what I'm hoping to talk about now is the other bar, the benefits bar, which is based on the social cost of carbon. And in assessing the social cost of carbon here in Vermont, what that really looks like is we look at what is the value or the cost, the financial cost of emitting 1 ton of climate pollution today. What are we going to have to pay in the future? And those are things like climate damages from floods or things like impacts on human health. And so, Senator Bray, you asked a little earlier, how do we feel costs? And I just wanted to note that the social cost of carbon is the tool that we use to assess those costs. And it's in the aggregate, and it's an economic tool. It's not a conversation you have with your neighbor and what the cost of flooding was, particularly on her or him, but it's helpful in that way. It helps describe what the cost will be for each ton emitted today. And so I just wanted to note that that background and sort of circling back to your question, Senator Bray. But the point I really wanted to make here is I think that we are underestimating the benefits. And I don't think that we are really using the Vermont Climate Action Plan recommendations as I understood them to be made on how we assess the social cost of carbon. So, for example, if you look at the Vermont Climate Action Plan, it has a section on the social cost of carbon. It begins on page 52. If anybody wants to sort of Google it and pull it up, you can take a look. And Vermont adopted the New York model. And in New York, they use a series of what are called discount rates to help them assess the cost of the social cost of carbon. And they range all the way from 0 up to 3%. These models that were, or this model that we're looking at here, adopted a 2% discount rate. Basically, to like dewonk all of that, this is sort of in the middle, if you will. This is sort of the in the middle assessment of what the benefits will be. And I would just note that in the Vermont Climate Action Plan, it was decided that we should look at the New York model, which has this range. And we haven't actually presented the range here of what, in fact, the benefits would look like if the discount rate were estimated at 1, for example. I also just wanted to note that the Vermont Climate Council specifically requested that when moving forward, Vermont would look at sensitivities of the different discount rates. So 1, 2, 3, 0, for example, none of which has been done here. So I just wanted to point this out because the discount rate matters a lot in how we estimate the benefits. And I'll just recall that when the social cost of carbon was being deliberated by the Vermont Climate Council, the youth representative to the Vermont Climate Council was pushing really hard for a discount rate of 1. Because she, as a younger person, will be living in the future when these harms are being felt. And so for her, and I'm not trying to speak for her, I'm just trying to paraphrase what she said, for her, these costs are extraordinarily real. They're not hypothetical things. And so I would just recommend that we do follow what the Climate Action Plan suggested, that we look at the series of different ways in which discount rates can be assessed, and that when we do so, we keep in mind, the folks who are really going to be impacted by these decisions, folks like the youth members of the Climate Council.
Thanks, Chase.
You're welcome. Thank you. Brian,
is this a response to Chase?
Yeah, it is. And I think maybe I'm jumping ahead in the queue, but Chase may have just answered my question. My recollection was that the SIA analysis originally used a 1% discount rate, and the benefits were considerably higher than on the slide that's shown here. So I'm not sure what the decision to change that was.
Yeah, so the 1% discount rate was used originally because it was kind of embedded in the workbook that from the avoided energy supply costs that kind of pulled data from. But the 2% discount rate was the middle of the road value, as Chase said, that the Climate Council decided upon to use to evaluate. And so that's why 2% is shown here.
Yeah, I guess in response to, in the years that I've been paying attention to climate change, it seems like all of our projections and estimates come up short, that the impacts are worse than we anticipate. And I just see that as accelerating. So I would agree with Chase that if we could consider other ways to estimate the benefits, the benefits would be helpful.
Or at the very least, just do what the Climate Action Plan said, which is look at the range of possible social costs of carbon. So there could be an assessment of, a discount rate of 1 and 2 and 3, if that's the course you'd prefer to take. But I think Brian's right. And I think the events of this summer really bear out how real and how substantial,
so in the interest of time, I'm going to turn this back to TJ for a minute and just ask, what is realistic if you wanted to ask of the data or to run of the model?
I think in this case, I think that, you know, these two different processes are, I'll admit, are a little frustrating because we've had a stakeholder process to discuss this, and the request to kind of show that was not talked about, and a number of the entities who are requesting this now did not nominate to be on the stakeholder advisory group. So I making changes at the 11th hour, when they have the potential to have a meaningful impact on the discussion. And I'm not saying that this doesn't, but so
it's just I
guess where I'm landing is that I don't think the department is going to kind of rerun the model with these numbers, but the model is available and you can plug in the different numbers if you.
That is the question that I was asking, is if the model's available and people can take it and run the numbers that they're curious about, if that's feasible.
Right. And so we've made it available upon request, the model. Yep. We've got one request this week for it. And so now because it's such a big model, I think it's hard to post on our website is what I've been told. So we're trying to get it to the folks who requested it.
Great. So we can get that email back out to working group members if they have that request. I'm going to go back to my queue. Peter, you're up next. This is your queue question rather than a discussion of the continued topic, or you can change gears depending on.
All right, great, thanks. First, I just want to put on the record that, Rev is a member of the stakeholder advisory group that the Department of Public Service has convened, and on September 11th, September 29th, and October 25th, we asked the department for the inputs on what they're using to estimate the cost of renewable energy, and we did not hear back. And the first time we looked at what went into their inputs on the cost of renewables was when we got the final report earlier this week. So we did ask, and I understand if they didn't have time, or the people at SEA were just doing their modeling and didn't have time to do it, but we did try to get this information before this meeting. The other thing I just really want to put out there, going back to the beginning of the meeting, I did hear TJ say a couple times, or at least once, that certain scenarios are not, quote, cost effective for ratepayers. And that is a very subjective analysis. I mean, I pay money each month to have my trash and recycling and compost taken away. The most cost effective thing for me to do would just be to dump everything in the trash, and I would pay the least amount of money, but that's not the right thing to do. And I guess I just want to really separate out, when we talk about what the cost of these things are, there's more than just a pure cost effectiveness or ratepayers lens we need to view things through. We don't do that all the time in our society. We do often pay more for things when we know it's the right thing to do.
So Peter, if there was a question that you wanted working group members to stay curious about while they were looking at results, what would that question be?
There really isn't a question.
Okay.
I just want to say that, that there's a lot of subjectivity coming from what the department is doing when they present their results, or not a lot, but that was one example of subjectivity, a subjective analysis of data that I thought was a little, overstating the case.
Okay. So one of the things you're cautioning is making decisions just purely on data and modeling and taking other things into account. Okay. And
now that we're presenting on data and modeling.
Mm-hmm. So today is about presenting on the data and modeling. And here's the time crunch that I'm facing. We have public comment, and I don't know what the quantity of public comment is, but I think, Brian, you might have gotten your question in there already, but I had two other people on the queue. That's Representative Sibilia and also Mia, who we haven't heard from yet.
So we have 11 public comments.
11 public comments. Okay. So my inclination is to hear what was top of mind for those two of you who had distinct topics from what we've talked about already. It will be brief, and then move to public comment. Representative Sibilia, did you have a separate topic from what's already been talked about? You're next on the queue, if so. You're muted if you're speaking. I'm going to shift gears then and go, Mia, to you, and then I'll come back to Representative Sibilia.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask if there was a way that this analysis provided by the Brattle Group could, apply some perspective on the impacts on low and moderate income households, especially low income households. the rates will be the rates, but we know that that's a larger share of the household budget and energy burden for the lowest income households. And I'm also not sure that the benefits will necessarily be felt by those households, given that they will have less resources to be able to electrify their homes. And I think Dean said it really well when this is like a problem of the commons, where regardless of actual benefits, we all have to pitch in to deal with this climate crisis, which also affects low-income households. But if there isn't really resources to help low-income households adapt to our new electric economy, I'm really worried that this will just be another source of income inequality. So I don't know if there's a way to sort of price that into our discussions. Thanks.
Mhm.
So short answer is, and it'll be unsatisfying, is yes, we do intend to look at the income breakout of the incidence of cost and the effects on consumption for each of the brackets, but we don't have those results today, and I'm sorry about that. You make excellent points. There's another aspect that we're not able to incorporate here, and that is rate making. Rate making strategy can change the incidence of costs across customer groups, including income classes. We're not modeling that, but that is an important lever that the legislature and the public service department have to their hand.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to seeing your analysis.
Representative Sibilia, we'll come back to you if you're online to see what other topic you had top of mind.
Again, can I just take her spot for a second?
You can, and then we'll move to, yes, please do.
Yeah, this is for Dean Murphy, I think. You talked a lot about the tragedy of the commons, and one of the things we know as a small state is that one of our best ways to make a difference is demonstrating that what can be done. And I guess I'm wondering if there's any economists out there who have modeled tipping points, or how change does happen, and incremental benefits and roles of our actions. It's a larger topic. It's just something I'd be curious about even as a side.
It's a very important topic, and I've had this discussion with other states, particularly in New England, that their biggest impact may be in demonstrating what's possible and setting an example for the rest of the world. Because in the end, if Vermont zeroes out its carbon emissions, it will almost not matter globally. However, if Vermont can provide an example that will be followed by many others, it can make potentially large impact. I don't have specialized expertise in this area, so I can't speak to it beyond that, but it's an excellent point.
Do you know if anyone's doing that work?
I suspect some are, but I'm not familiar with it. Wanjun, do you know something?
The modeling the public goods phenomenon, the tragedy of the commons, there is one academic that comes to mind, Thomas Rutherford.
Great, thank you.
He's at Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin-Madison.
But the modeling question is another question even beyond that, and the sort of social contagion of actions like this are. I know there are people looking at it, but I'm not familiar with that area.
Wanjun, Dean, TJ, thank you very much for presenting and speaking to the data and pulling up slides. I am shifting gears now and yielding the floor to the co-chairs for public comment. We have 11 people for public comment. That leaves about a minute per person.
Yeah, actually the number's grown. We're at 14 now, so we're gonna have to do rapid fire, although I think many of these people already are familiar with the drill. So I'm going to call out names and ask people to speak for a minute or less, because otherwise we won't get to everyone on the list. That's always a little dissatisfying for some folks, but please know that you can email the committee with your full comments, and they'll become part of our record and be distributed to every committee member. So with that, I'd like to jump right into the list. Stephanie DeBettito.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie, as you just said, and I live in Barrie. I have a 16-month-old son named Charlie, and I'm here because this is something I really care about, and I'm especially interested in supporting Vermont moving towards a 100% renewable energy future that comes from new wind and solar and storage, and not old resources like large hydro. I support a reformed RES that prioritizes and incentivizes in-state low-emission renewables, ensures we are moving towards a renewable energy future and towards our goals. We're adding new sources of wind and solar, ends the practice of using Hydro-Quebec renewable energy credits to offset Vermont's use of fossil fuels, prohibits additional large hydropower to be used to meet new renewable energy goals, and does not export the negative impacts of dirty energy to communities and ecosystem beyond our borders. This is really important to me because I feel like in my individual life and in my household, we've taken a lot of steps to ensure that we're making a difference in our climate impact and towards climate change, but it feels far greater. And we as individuals can only do so much. It's really our elected officials that need to be making large steps into future improvements. And as a constituent, I want to ensure that those who represent me are moving my values and what's important to me and to my family forward. And we're already seeing these large scale impacts in terms of climate disasters, just differences in our weather and our growing patterns.
Stephanie, I'm sorry to interrupt. It is at 1:45 now.
Okay, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Sylvia Desatel. And next up after that will be Nikki Giraffe. So Sylvia? Okay, not hearing Sylvia. We'll get back to her if she comes back on. Nikki Giraffe? You're having the unmute button struggle.
Okay, sorry.
There you
Hi,
are.
my name's Nikolai Giraffe. I'm from Cabot, and I have two kids, ages 2 and 6. I'm here because I strongly believe that renewable energy is a key part of our survival as humans, as well as the survival of all other life on this planet. And similar to Stephanie, I support a reformed renewable energy standard that prioritizes our in-state low emissions renewables and especially like local community energy projects, and makes this power accessible to low and moderate income Vermonters. I want to see us be adding new sources of wind and solar to meet our renewable energy goals. I don't want to see us using Hydro-Quebec or other large-scale hydropower because it's just not a real solution. It actually is making things worse. And I do believe our renewable energy standard needs to not export the negative impact to other communities and ecosystems. It needs to be a real clean energy standard. And for the sake of my kids, our kids, and in truth, all life, we really need these real solutions, not corporate money grabs in disguise. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next up is Earl Hatley. And after Earl, Sally Burrell. So Earl.
Quiet, everyone. I'm Earl Hatley. I'm an enrolled member of the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi. I'm living in Quechee, Vermont. I'm very concerned because next year we hit 1.5 C globally above pre-industrial temperatures. And by 2030, we'll be at 1.7 degrees C, according to Dr. James Hansen. We're out of time. And so we need true solutions now for our climate crisis. What I would like to see is a clean renewable energy standard bill that brings us to solar and thermal energy systems for our communities, community solar. And with this, I would like to see equity for low income and BIPOC communities so that we can make this transition, weatherization, energy use reduction for our communities, and to get off of Hydro-Quebec as soon as we're able to do that, generate at least 30% solar and thermal energy for our state. And so I'd like to see that transition as quickly as possible, and to stop selling and buying renewable energy credits and do a clean system for our state. We can do this. We need to buckle down and do this because it's cheaper to be reactive than proactive. It's cheaper to build these systems out and do the right thing rather than to clean up the mess when we have a crisis like the flooding that we just had. That is a lot more expensive to be reactive to climate crisis.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Earl, but you're at 2 minutes.
Yes. Thank you very much, Olivini.
Thank you. Sally Burrell.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity. So I definitely support solar and wind and reusing waste heat in thermal energy networks and using ground source heat pumps to shave the peak grids. As far as renewable energy credits, I would prefer the most egregious feels like burning trees or piping methane related gases because of particulates and leakage and potency. And I feel like RECs do nothing really to change the overall emissions. For instance, I know you all know this, but I just have to say it. Say I have a dangerous biting dog and my neighbors, especially the children, are seriously affected. So I send money to my friends in New York who have 3 really sweet cats, and they send me a stack of sweet kitty credits, but it doesn't work. It's all the same. The neighborhood's still angry and nothing has changed. So I feel that's the same with RECs. No matter where we send money, total greenhouse gases and local air pollution is going to be the same. And all who participate are complicit. I've been embarrassed at regional meetings as a Vermonter because they see what we're doing and they don't respect it. It's kind of a bummer to feel that way because I feel like we want to be so green. Anyway, that's all I want to say. And I really appreciate what you're all doing to help reform this. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Next up is Kim Horning-Marcy, and after that, Joe Wantek.
Good morning, and thank you all for your service. Very thoughtful comments have already been made, and appreciate all your hard work. I am here to encourage you to move as quickly as possible to more solar and wind and backup battery. 30% new in Vermont would be great, and 30% new solar and wind on the grid would be great. And I think we are way behind all the other New England states. And by my estimate, we are 48th nationally in creating our own green energy. So the false solutions aren't helping us. And I want to really focus on a false solution that involves burning wood. Our single largest stationary greenhouse gas emitter is the Burlington McNeil wood burning plant, and the second in line is the Rygate wood burning plant. Current science does not support that wood is renewable, and I'm going to send you this statement, and it has a letter from 1,000 scientists to President Biden, very recent letter, easy to read, easy to understand why wood is not renewable. Nor does current science recognize renewable natural gas, green hydrogen, basically the bottom line is anything you burn is contributing to climate change. And now I want to focus on direct impacts. I want to refer you to a July 24, 2023 Vermont Digger editorial by Dr. Barkoff. He noted that with the wildfire smoke and the heat earlier in the summer, his emergency room was flooded with young and old with severe respiratory issues, and heat-caused exhaustion and dehydration. He concluded, well, in his editorial, he states, "It is no longer COVID. Now it is the very air we are breathing that is killing and hospitalizing Vermonters." And he was addressing climate change in the whole letter.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you're over 2 minutes now.
So I'm going to conclude with that and say thank you again for your service.
Thank you. Joe Wantuk is up now, and on deck is Aiden DiLorenzo.
Hi, my name's Joe. I live in Northfield with my wife and child, and we have another on the way in March. And I also I want to advocate for my children and press that you know, the future will be more challenging for them with climate change. And so I think we have a moral responsibility to respond to that. And reforming the renewable energy standard is part of that response. Climate change is one of the scariest challenges of our time, but I wanted to state that for you folks that solving it doesn't have to be. One doesn't have to go far to find a lot of the new fascinating technologies to help us green our energy budget. And as a member of my local energy committee, I know implementing these efforts are often collaborative between the grassroots, businesses, and governments, which strengthens our social networks. So this is exciting work you are doing. This is exciting work we are doing. And it's going to be a lot more exciting doing this work than dealing with the effects of climate change if we don't act. So for our children, I believe in reforming the Renewable Energy Standard Act to lay a foundation of switching to 100% renewable energy, and we have to be 30 in state, 30 out of state to get to 100. And those renewables include solar, wind, geothermal, not methane emitting Canadian large hydro, natural gas, wood burning, or biofuels. Thank you.
Thank
Senator
you.
Bray, how many people do you have left on your list?
So we have Aiden DiLorenzo is up, and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Are you wanting to go over time and take all of those comments?
If members of the committee are willing to stay a little long, that would be great. I know some people have hard stops and they'll have to leave, so I regret that. I'm going to ask everyone who's still in the queue, if you've already spoken previous meetings, you might consider writing to the committee. But yeah, let's keep going, and please stick to a minute if at all possible. And again, if you have a lot more to say, just write the committee. We're happy to hear from you in full, but we're running short of time.
Aiden, I think you're up. The microphone is giving you trouble. Aiden, are you able to unmute? There you go.
Yes. Hello. My name is Aiden DiLorenzo. I'm a student at Middlebury College, and I'm a member of the environmental club here. As you work to amend the Vermont Renewable Energy Standard, I ask that you focus on the one most important thing when it comes to climate change, and that is the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases that are being released into the atmosphere. It does not matter which energy sources are classified as renewable. The only important distinction to make is between those energy sources that release greenhouse gases and those that don't. Renewable gas and biomass plants are just different methods of burning carbon. As was already mentioned, the McNeil biomass plant is the biggest source of CO2 emission in Vermont. It does not change the hard numbers, even if it is called renewable, because the trees can theoretically grow back. All it does is greenwash the energy source and incentivize logging. For this reason, I find regulation based off of renewable energy credits ineffective at addressing climate change as a whole. The same goes for carbon offset credits. Most of these efforts are centered around planting trees to offset carbon emissions, but this is This just puts off the hard work of decarbonizing our energy sources. We are releasing 4,000 times the amount of CO2 into the atmosphere than pre-industrial levels. And there is not room on planet Earth to plant 4,000 times the number of trees that we currently have. There's simply not enough land for that to be a feasible solution. The only thing here that matters is reducing the amount of CO2 that we are producing. This means radically increasing the amount of solar and wind production that we have, electrifying home heating and cars, and phasing out of combustion-based electricity sources. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard Evans and then Ella Roloffs. I'm not seeing or hearing Richard. If you come back on, please speak up. Ella Roloffs.
Hi, my name is Ella Roloffs. I'm a student at Middlebury College. I'm here today to express my support for Vermont moving to a 100% renewable energy future that comes from new wind and solar and storage rather than old resources like large hydro. As someone who sees myself living in Vermont in the future, I hope that we can prioritize electricity sources that don't export the harms of energy production to other communities and those that actually reduce our carbon emissions, which means using wind and solar rather than large hydro. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Bruce Post, and then after Bruce, Annette Smith. Okay, I'm not hearing Bruce. Annette Smith.
Yes, Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I want to make some comments.
Annette, your mic just went in and out.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, please.
I'm a member of the stakeholder group for the RES update. So my comments are based on some of what I observed yesterday. Knowing what I do about what went into the model, I think that the emissions reductions are overestimated, and I think that the environmental estimates are underestimated. They need data, and that's quantifying nature is a bit of a challenge, but I do think that the environmental and societal costs are very much underestimated. Something that came out in yesterday's meeting, if you look at the different scenarios and there's wind in there, and the question came up, is that new wind? No, that's actually the wind that already exists in Vermont. And then what flows from that is that is one of the, by adding that to tier 2, that is one of the things that's resulting in the increase in costs. I think that's a very important point for the committee to be aware of, that when I asked about that I'm remembering that response was that was one of the major factors in why this costs were increasing in the different models. You all talked about the cost of net metering today, and I wanted to point out that in one of the workshops for net metering, the chair of the PUC made a very astute observation, and that is that the PUC does not know the costs or salaries or profits of the companies that are doing the net metering. And while the regulated utility costs are known, the costs of the merchant developers are not. And I actually think you should take a look at that as legislators. And I wanted to point out that in tier 2, as you think about increasing tier 2, knowing the challenges we're having with getting the standard offer projects built, that right now, tier 2, 10% requires 25 to 30 megawatts a year. If we increase it to 20%, that's 50 to 60 megawatts. If we increase it to 30%, that's 75 to 90 megawatts a year of new in-state with the credits retired. And I will also point out that there are a lot of comments that have been posted on your website, and I hope you will take a look at them. Thank you very much for hearing my comments.
Thank you. Ashley Adams and then Steve Crowley.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we can.
We can.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Ashley Adams. I live in Burlington. I don't have a prepared statement. I'm working. I might be interrupted. I apologize. Thank you for taking my call, though. I didn't engage in the DPS stakeholder sessions. And like most people, I simply don't have time. And I hope you don't expect a groundswell because most people don't have time, but I'm very concerned. I wish I had more time to engage. And, you know, really as citizens, we should be able to trust that this state is doing the right thing and recognize that all combustion is contributing to irreversible ecological collapse, period. Your job is to remove polluting energy sources from the res, period. And I have to say, I do not have a lot of trust in this process, given Vermont's history, given Vermont's track record. I share the embarrassment expressed by an earlier commentator on the state of climate policy in Vermont. Just look around us, look at surrounding states. Look what they're doing, look what they have done. There are some great models out there that we could be following. And I just really want to remind you that we must count carbon emissions from burning trees. It's worse than any fossil fuel. The science is long settled on this. And as a Burlington resident, I'm well aware that McNeil needs to be shut down, that we shouldn't be pouring $42 million into the steam pipe boondoggle. It should not be allowed to move forward. Rygate needs to be shut down. We need to stop greenwashing burning of trees. And if I sound exasperated, I am. I'm very frustrated. I also want to just mention, I know I'm probably running out of time. When I signed on, I believe I heard Amy Sheldon mention the concept of tipping points, and I just want to applaud her for bringing this concept into the conversation. And I'd like to hear a whole lot more of it because we are meeting and exceeding tipping points, and policymakers need to be aware of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And our last public comment this morning, Steve Crowley. Steve, I'm not, your image looks frozen. I don't know if you're still
hello,
there.
Can you hear me? I think I'm, hello?
Yes,
Hi, we can
please
hear
go
you.
ahead.
Okay.
Yes,
great.
we can.
Okay. Well, thanks, Crowley here with the Vermont Community Solar Association, and also a member of the stakeholder group with the department. I want to make a couple of comments. One is about the social cost of carbon. We did talk about this yesterday. My recommendation then was much the same as what people brought up today. This is so important. It's the way we have of incorporating the potential and real damage from climate change. You know, all you have to do is think about what happened in July in Vermont to think about how the scale of damage is. And there's a lot of research showing that we are underestimating that social cost of carbon. My recommendation yesterday was to provide a range for the decision makers to apply to their thinking. So I'll just repeat that here today. The other comment I'd make is that I think we have to think outside the box on things like net metering and other rates. We have a traditional way that we've paid for these things and provided incentives, but there are other options out there. We've got to keep in mind that there are federal subsidies coming in that will change the picture. We don't have to stick with plowing these subsidies into the rate structure. That's a regressive way to go. Maybe there are better ways to do this. Maybe there's a green bank. Maybe there are other, maybe there are incentives for banks to provide reduced and longer term financing that will bring the effective cost of going with solar down. So if all of our thinking is about how this is going to affect rates, then we're missing big opportunities there. So I hope that's an important part of what the legislature considers on this. So thank you very much for all your work.
Thank you, Steve. That concludes public comment. I have a meeting waiting for me, so I'm going to leave now and say goodbye to all of you and leave it to Jen and my co-chair to wrap and close the meeting. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Senator Bray. I think wrapping and closing the meeting is relatively brief. We will put together a time-stamped summary of sorts for today. There's a couple next steps. It looks like the most tangible next step is for TJ with the help of Ben and Lewis. We'll have an agenda, and it's going to come up quickly. Representative Sheldon, I know we're meeting on Friday morning with co-chairs to figure out what that agenda looks like. And then there's a Thanksgiving holiday in between. So all of you on this call will probably have limited time in which to prep for that meeting, but we'll try to get the information out to you with as much advance as we can, given the holiday, hopefully before the Thanksgiving holiday. Am I forgetting anything else for next steps?
I don't think so. I think we're good. I think with that, thank you all for your presence and presentations and putting up with Zoom, but I think it worked out well. So I'm glad we did it that way. And we'll be in person next time.
That's true.
And have a great Thanksgiving, everybody.